About 40 years ago, in the movie Deliverance, the character Lewis said the system is going to fail. After that, survival. Survival has been a topic ever since then, and these days it tends to focus on a collapse of civilization, a collapse of law and order, a collapse of manufacturing, transportation, and commerce, the whole enchilada going down the drain. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, and there's no particular need to belabor the details. And I'm also sure that none of us are eager to do any shooting, and we all hope nothing ever happens, but we agree that we need to think about preparedness. Now, one thing that does not get a lot of discussion is how to keep a gun running when everything has gone deep and serious, when supplies are limited and we must make maximum use of whatever is available. What kind of maintenance techniques will we need under those conditions, and what can we do to ensure the gun will continue to be serviceable? That's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about it in the context of two rifles, the AR-15 and a Ruger Mini 14. We'll toss in a couple of other things that might be helpful, including some details on these two guns, including some targets showing how accurate they are. The Ruger is a tactical model with a traditional synthetic stock. It is very similar to a 500 series ranch rifle, except it has a shorter barrel and a flash hider. The AR-15 is a Bushmaster carbon 15. It has a carbon fiber receiver. Its interior otherwise is very much like many other AR variants you would encounter, and in that regard it's quite typical of the types. Now what we're looking at here is a scene that's very familiar to AR owners. This is the gun opened up and the bolt assembly and carrier disassembled. And it's generally considered that the most rudimentary cleaning of an AR involves taking the gun down at least this far. I have seen cleaning instructions for an AR in which the gun owner is instructed to assemble a group of cleaning products and tools and other odds and ends that total about 20 in number. Now this is a fine idea and I have no quarrel with it, but if indeed the end of the world happens, we're all going to be forced into using expedients. And when it comes to gun maintenance, we need expedients that will work. And the two main objectives are going to be keeping the thing functioning, dealing with the effects of shooting, and making sure there is no corrosion happening. My thoughts on gun maintenance out in the field have been largely influenced by my hunting experience. Years going by, I used to go out for days and days at a time and sleep out in tents and so forth, and I would be out in all kinds of cruddy weather, and I'd have my gun with me all the time. This is a shot of one of my old hunting camps, and as you could see, I was never extravagant about anything. And I didn't carry a lot of gun cleaning stuff with me either. But nonetheless, I did manage to keep the gun functioning. And I never had any problem with corrosion. And when I got home, the gun still looked brand new. I used shortcuts in gun maintenance, but they were effective shortcuts. And I saw to it that whatever gun cleaning supplies I had went a long way. And I got a lot of mileage out of them. I would run into a fellow or two occasionally carrying a gun that was corroded on the outside, and their attitude was they didn't care what it looked like on the outside as long as it was working good and oiled on the inside, and maybe that's a thought to hang on to also. An AR-15 needs some special consideration, which we'll go into later, but I found that during my hunting period, the barrels and the exterior of the gun were really the easy part. I had an oily cloth that I kept in a plastic bag, and I used that to wipe the outside of the gun. I used that piece of cloth many times, and it always did the trick. If I shot the gun, I'd run a brush down the bore once or twice, followed up with an oily patch, and that's where I'd stop. If in the interim, between shooting, I felt the need to run an oily patch down the bore, I would save that patch in the bag with the cloth, and if I felt it was damp and I needed to wipe the bore out with oil later, I just used the patch over again. I don't know if anyone is recoiling in horror at my seemingly lackadaisical attitude, but I can tell you I have one of the guns that I used back then, and the bore is still about as clean and shiny as it ever was. It has no pitting. I've certainly seen other used guns that have bores in much worse shape than mine. All of this has reinforced my view that a light coat of oil in the bore and on the outside will go a long way to preventing rust. Now back to the AR-15. AR-15 variants have a long-standing reputation of needing a lot of maintenance to keep running. That thinking has become more focused in recent years, and what is emphasized these days is keeping the gun lubricated. There is a fairly recent trend in thinking among the users of AR variants on lubrication. I don't know who originated it, but when I heard about it, I thought immediately that it was a very good idea and a very sound idea. And that idea is to use wheel bearing grease, the same kind of stuff that is used on motor vehicles, on the bolt and carrier of the gun. This is something you would not want to put into the chamber and the barrel of the gun because it could create problems with pressure and possibly a barrel obstruction. But when it comes to the bolt and the carrier, this stuff will work very effectively. Virtually every user of an AR variant understands that the direct impingement system that sends hot gas into the action of the gun will burn up or dry out oil sooner rather than later. Wheel bearing grease, on the other hand, is very thick, tenacious stuff, and it has excellent lubrication qualities. Search the internet and you will find people who use this technique on AR variants, and they will tell you they shoot the gun 2,000 rounds without a cleaning or adding lubrication, at least regarding the bolt and carrier. I've used that technique on this gun, and the one thing that surprised me is that even if it seemed I was applying the grease liberally to the bolt and carrier and its components, when I was done, I had actually used very little of the wheel bearing grease. After I had shot the gun about 250 times, including 100 rounds of dirty steel case Russian ammunition, I took the gun apart to see precisely what was happening inside. There was much less fouling than I had expected, and the grease looked like it had just been applied, with one exception. That exception was right here on the bolt behind the gas rings. At that spot, the grease was completely gone and the metal was covered with fouling. I spent some time with a flashlight snooping around the bolt and the gun, and I learned something that I did not know. There is a hole at the bottom of the gas key that sends gas inside the bolt carrier, and that hole is approximately here. If you look at slow motion film of one of these guns being fired, you'll notice that as soon as the bolt begins to move, gas shoots out of these two holes here. Where does it come from? It comes from the hole that's at the bottom of the gas key. Now, none of this would mean anything one way or the other, except for the fact that this is happening very close to the gas rings, and the gas rings form a very tight seal inside the bolt carrier, and the gas rings are something that you want to keep lubricated. There was still plenty of grease in front of the gas rings, but based on what I could see, it didn't look like it was keeping the rings very well lubricated. As most AR users know, when the bolt begins to come back, the gas rings can be seen through those two holes on the side of the bolt that I pointed out previously. So I think it would be a good plan to supplement the wheel bearing grease on the bolt by adding a drop of oil through one of those holes when the bolt is pulled back enough to expose the rings through the holes. Do this occasionally and those rings will stay wet. As many of you know, fouling will accumulate in the chamber of an AR, so something more than a simple oil patch on a cleaning rod is going to be needed. Now, there are two pretty readily available options that I can think of. One of them is this. This is a Hoppy's bore snake, and it will do a pretty good job of cleaning the AR chamber and barrel if you pull it through the bore 3 times starting from the breech. Now, it doesn't do anything to lubricate the bore by itself, which is something of a disadvantage, and as an expedient, you might be able to soak the tail end of it in oil and get by that way. Also, if the bolt and carrier have been greased, it would be my first choice to lock the bolt open and insert the snake through the ejection port, and that's not very hard to do. Another option is this. This is an Otis cleaning kit. I think they call it an M16 kit. It has a brush that's very good for cleaning an AR chamber. Like the bore snake, you insert the cable at the chamber, and I find that I can do everything by getting the cable in through the open ejector port. One thing about this that's nice is the cable will pull almost any thickness of patch through the bore, so if you run out of manufactured patches and you're reduced to using whatever fabric you can find, this cable will pull it through the bore. And as a last detail, Otis gives you instructions on how to use the same patch more than once. And now the easy one, the Mini 14. When I give this gun a routine cleaning, I take it down this far and no further. What I do is lock the bolt into the hold open position, and if I pay attention to what I'm doing, it will remain that way. Either the bore snake or the Otis cable will do a fine job of cleaning the chamber and barrel on this. Unlike the AR-15, the Mini 14 hardly accumulates any fouling inside the chamber itself. When it comes to the bolt, Ruger tells you there is no need to disassemble the Mini 14 bolt, and I have never done it. If I turn the gun upside down with the bolt forward and then back, I can access every part of the bolt and every part of the interior of the receiver to wipe them off and lubricate them if necessary. With the Mini 14, where the fouling accumulates is in the front of the gun, where what the owner's manual calls the gas pipe sends gas into the end of the operating rod to cycle the action. With the bolt held open, these parts can be exposed and dealt with. The gas pipe needs to be wiped off and cleaned. It doesn't hurt to clean the opening on the end of the operating rod if you have time. I've lost track of how many times I've shot this Ruger, but I have sort of pushed the envelope to see what I could get away with. And I can tell you that unless the gas pipe and the end of the operating rod are lubricated, it's possible to get some corrosion that will essentially rust the end of the operating rod to the gas pipe. Now, when this happens, it's no big trick to just smack the charging handle and knock the thing loose, but clearly there needs to be lubricant on the gas pipe, and wheel bearing grease is my first choice there. Although I will say the first time you fire the gun after you've greased that pipe, the thing will smoke like mad, but the grease will stay there for quite a while, and it will stay there much longer than a routine gun oil would. Ruger says the gas pipe is self-cleaning, and I assume they mean the interior of the pipe. They tell you there's no need to ever take the pipe off, and I've never done it. Inside the stock is a stock liner, and fouling can accumulate there also. If one doesn't clean it, it doesn't affect the shooting of the gun, but it can make this charging of the gun a bit on the sticky side. So a dab of wheel bearing grease on that liner will basically take care of you for a long time. It might be worth mentioning that I originally considered buying a stainless steel ranch rifle, but I opted for this one with the shorter barrel. It could be that with the stainless steel model, the gas pipe and the operating rod are going to be much easier to deal with. Now, the carbon fiber receiver on the AR-15 is something that a lot of people are afraid of. I was never particularly concerned about the carbon receiver on this. There are a lot of different ways to make carbon fiber, and it's been said many times elsewhere that it's stronger and lighter than aluminum. The one thing I did worry about a little bit was abrasion. When I first got the gun, I would hear a little rasping noise when I'd slide the bolt back and forth in the receiver, so I decided to fix that. Basically what I did was polish the edges of the front of the bolt carrier to make sure everything was smooth. I did this with ultra-fine sandpaper and ultra-light steel wool, and I gave it a very light touch. I slid it back in the receiver and racked it back and forth, and it was nowhere near as noisy as it was. Also, I noticed that this part of the receiver where the charging handle latch fastened was getting a bit frayed. I looked at the charging handle and noticed that that latch had razor-sharp edges. I used some light sandpaper and steel wool to smooth that off. So far, it seems to have fixed the problem. Bushmaster's online catalog calls this a super light carbine, and when I got it, it looked like this. It weighed 5 pounds, and I was attracted by its weight and its price. It was used. And in short order, I had it looking like this because I wanted to put iron sights on it. Now, the front sight is mounted on a quad rail, and I wasn't sure that I would get that to work, but I did. Certainly, it would have been my first choice for the front sight to be over the gas block, which would have made it about 2 inches further away from the rear sight. Even if that were the case, the sights would still be 4 inches closer together than the iron sights on the Ruger. While that's certainly not ideal for the Bushmaster, it's not a deal breaker either, because the gun will do this at 20 yards, and I can keep everything on the target at 100 yards with the iron sights. A larger goal was to co-witness the sights with a good red dot scope, which of course means the sights can be seen through and used through the red dot scope if one so chooses. And the red dot I chose is a Bushnell TRS-25, which is an exceptionally good red dot for the money. Bushnell says this will run 3,000 hours on a battery, and it will. I have tested it. Of course, the uncertain post-apocalyptic future being what it might be, one cannot count on having an indefinite supply of batteries, ergo the need for decent iron sights. It is worth mentioning that on all the screws of the sights and the quad rail, I put varnish on the screws. Now, this is an old 20th century method. The reason I did it is there are many types of products that resemble Loctite, and not all of them are as good as Loctite. Varnish, however, I've had fantastic luck with over the decades, and it's never let me down. What I use these days is an indoor-outdoor polyurethane. I put it on the screws, wind them down tight, let the thing dry a couple days. With the Mini 14, there's only been one thing about it that I was motivated to change, and that was the iron sights. I assume on the front side of this gun they use the same assembly they do the normal ranch rifles. However, if they do that, that creates the effect of making the front sight higher, relatively speaking, because it is in fact closer to the rear sight. In order to zero the gun, I had to raise the rear peep to a height that made me uncomfortable. I then took a file and very carefully lowered that front sight. Even so, I still wasn't crazy about the rear sight, because in order to change the elevation, you had to loosen one of the windage screws and then retighten it. And I found that when I did that, the windage would shift on me a little bit. So I dealt with that by replacing the back sight with this Tec sight, which I like much better. It was much, much easier and much quicker to zero this gun at 100 yards with this new sight on it. Also with the Ruger, my first choice is a 1.5 by 5 variable scope. When hunting, I have used 2 by 7 variable scopes and have found them extremely quick to use and very effective at anything from 6 yards out to 150. But who knows if even quality optics can survive an uncertain future. Ergo, the need for top flight iron sights on the Ruger also. We should talk about magazines for a minute. I've always used Ruger magazines in the Mini 14, and despite the price, I have no problem doing that, because like the gun, they are extremely robust and extremely reliable and extremely tough. For the AR, there are many good choices among polymer magazines, but one thing to watch out for in the long term is the polymer magazine's lips may deform if they're kept loaded for long periods of time. That's why many such magazines come with spacers like this to prevent that from happening. If you have quality steel magazines, however, that's not a problem. And if indeed you are worried about a murky, uncertain future, you might want to get a couple of those. Both of these guns have their fans, and I'm a fan of both of them. I've never had a single problem shooting either one of them. If I'm forced to stop and maybe do the math in my head, I'd say I probably have somewhere in the vicinity of at least 900 rounds through the Ruger. And with the Bushmaster, it's nowhere near that yet, but so far it's batting 1,000. The AR certainly has a certain sort of sex appeal that the Ruger doesn't have, but the Ruger is an absolutely bomb-proof gun, and if you want to shoot something, it is truly wicked. In its current configuration with the red dot on it, the AR weighs slightly less than 6.5 pounds, and that is far, far lighter than many ARs you can find. The Ruger weighs about 6 3/4 with no scope on it. Put the scope on it, and you're pushing it up close to about 7 1/4. There are a number of piston-driven AR variants out there these days, and they have a reputation of not shooting a steel-cased ammunition reliably. This gun will shoot it reliably. Whether it's advisable to do that over the long term can be debated, but in the short term it will go through this gun. The Ruger, on the other hand, has a much huskier extractor than the AR does, and it will handle a steel case ammo no problem. And not only that, the Ruger will shoot and cycle ammunition, reloaded ammunition, that has been neck-sized only. First, I tested this with dummy rounds with no powder. Then I made real rounds, took it to the range, and they all just ran right through it. You cannot say that about the AR. Any reloads that go into an AR have to be sized full length along the case. What we have here are 2 rounds. The one on the left is a factory round, and the one on the right is a reloaded round that has been neck-sized only. And there's hardly anything about their outward appearances, except the soft-nosed bullet, that distinguishes the two. If at some point in the distant future you find ammunition and it was reloaded and it was neck-sized only, you're almost certainly going to find that the ammo will jam in the chamber of an AR as soon as you chamber a round, and you're going to have to figure out a way to knock the bolt back to get it out. We'll wrap it up with the targets. With the Mini 14, I've been able to consistently shoot groups of 2 inches or less at 100 yards using PMC ammunition and a 5-power scope. Here are some targets shot at different times. The first one is 1 13/16 inches. That's a hair over 1 3/4. Here's another one, the same group, 1 13/16. And here's one 1 1/4 inches. The Mini 14s of the 20th century had a reputation of not being very accurate, mainly because of their thin barrels. That problem seems to be solved with the 500 series because they have much thicker barrels. And again, this gun has a barrel that's shorter than the other ranch rifles, which can only make it stiffer by comparison. With the Bushmaster, I had to struggle with an inexpensive scope that I bought. It didn't have very much magnification, and the crosshairs were quite thick. It's labeled as a 4-power, but in actuality it's about a 2.5. And at 100 yards, the crosshairs would completely cover up a 2-inch black dot. I was able to shoot groups of about 2 1/4, despite the fact I could hardly see through that scope. And finally, at a time when I was running out of clean targets and PMC ammunition, I decided to ignore the bullseye and simply center the crosshairs on the middle of an old target I had taped up. I did it that way, and I got 1 5/8 inches with Tula ammo. And I'm sure that could be improved on with a better optic and better ammunition. So maybe we'll never have to deal with the end of the world, and instead we'll get to enjoy firearms like this. I hope that's true.